Good morning, everyone. This is Joe Armstrong. I went ahead and opened up the line so you're not getting the annoying recording about the webinar starting soon. And we're just going to wait for a minute or two. We got a lot of people joining here, so we'll wait for a bit. And you can hear Chris and I chatting away if we do in the meantime. So, Chris, I had to throw another log on the fire this morning. I have a bunch of snow in my yard yet. I don't suppose you have any snow there, do you?
No, not often. In fact, never. It's going to be a lovely, what is it, high 80s tomorrow, so about 30 degrees here tomorrow, nice and warm. A beautiful day. Yeah.
Great for you.
Yeah, well, where I live, we get no snow at any point. There's usually some snow up in the mountains, which is several hundred kilometers away, but where I live down here in Melbourne, it's always nice and warm. It does get cold, but definitely no snow on my lawn, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, cold is a relative term. So
yes.
Yeah, your cold is probably still plenty warm to Minnesota.
You'd probably still be wearing a short sleeve t-shirt when I think it's really cold.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got. I think we'll go ahead. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got people joining, and we've got 2 minutes after the hour. But welcome everyone. This is Joe Armstrong, and we are in the March Power Systems Virtual User Group webinar. I want to let everybody know that I am recording this session. So if I think I always hear, if you don't like recording, you can leave now type thing. So go ahead and leave now if you don't like the recording. I do have the presentation materials that we're going to go over this morning, and they are on the wiki site. A couple other things before we get started. One, a new YouTube channel created. So we used to have a YouTube channel. I put up all the replays on. If you've been listening for the last year, you know that was deleted at one point by somebody. And so I got permission to create a new one. We're combining replays to this. So we have another UK virtual user group that's run out of the UK by Jyoti Joda. And she puts her replays on the same YouTube channel. So if you go to that channel, you can look up some links to the information. You'll find information about her webinars as well. They're excellent webinars. In the US, they happen at like 4 in the morning. So you might not be able to attend them live, but you can go to this YouTube channel and watch those as well. 2 other bits of interest. Think, IBM's big conference of the year is next week in Las Vegas. So if you're going to Think and you want to look me up, I'll be there. Text me, write me an email or something. I'd be happy to meet with you at some point. Just say hi and chat for a bit. Also, TechU is coming end of April, beginning of May in Orlando. I have a discount code on the wiki for TechU, probably the best conference of the year in my opinion that IBM puts on. All the great, real smart people that can teach us things are at TechU. So look at the wiki if you want a discount code for that, and I'll be there as well, so feel free to look me up there. So for today, we're going to talk about an AIX specific topic. It used to be the AIX bug. I renamed it to the Power Systems Virtual User Group this year, but still covers some AIX specific stuff. Talking about migrating to AIX 7.2 with minimal downtime. And today we've got Chris Gibson joining us. Chris actually is in Australia. If you were listening earlier, you heard us talking about that. So it's 2 a.m. his time, and really appreciate Chris getting up in the middle of the night and to join us here. I tried to get him at the end of the month, but he's coming on vacation, actually coming to the US, I believe, for some vacation. So it'd be nice to welcome him here. And if you make TechU in Orlando, this upcoming TechU, you can see Chris live there as well. So it's great. So with that, Chris, I'll go ahead and let's see, a couple things about you first. So Chris, I said, is in Australia. He's a power systems consultant for IBM Lab Services there. We've had quite a few lab services people talking on the bugs these days, and they're just a wealth of information. Chris has been working with AIX since the late 90s. He's an active member of the AIX and Power Systems community. Chris has published several technical articles on IBM Developer Works, IBM Systems Magazine. He's co-authored IBM Red books on NIM, and he's worked with AIX 7.1 Differences Guide. Just a lot of things that Chris has been working on. He's available on Twitter, and he regularly posts. So we'll get some information on Chris from what he has here in his presentation. So with that, Chris, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. So as you said, I work in lab services down here in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm going to be taking you through how to migrate to AIX7 with minimal downtime. I've been working with AIX for a long time, nearly 20 years. And in that time, I've been fortunate enough to work on some red books, specifically around AIX and NIM, and also written a bunch of technical articles for IBM Systems Magazine and IBM Developer Works. And I also have my own AIX blog where I post regular updates on things I learn while I'm working out on site with customers who are working with large AIX environments. And as Joe said, I'm also fairly active on social media as well. And I regularly tweet things about AIX and Power, particularly if I find something interesting, I'll certainly tweet it out so people can see. So this session today is really a how-to session. I'm going to take you through how to migrate to AIX7 and how to do that with minimal downtime. I'm going to talk about a specific procedure that you can use that will allow you to migrate and avoid lengthy outages associated with moving to the latest release of the AIX operating system. I'm going to focus heavily on NIM and specifically one part of NIM. Now, NIM, which is the Network Installation Manager, has been part of the AIX operating system since the mid-90s. And if you're working with AIX today and you're administering large numbers of AIX systems, then I would imagine you're already familiar with NIM to some degree. It's an excellent tool for administering large numbers of AIX systems, updating, installing, backing up, patching. It's a really fantastic feature of the AIX operating system. In the session today, we're going to focus primarily on one particular area, and that is the NIM alternate disk migration tool, or NIM-ADM or NIM-ADM as some people refer to it. Using this tool, you can perform AIX migrations without having to incur a lengthy outage that you would typically see on an AIX migration using conventional procedures. So I'm going to, in this session, take you through actual procedures that I've used as an IBM customer and also as an IBM consultant to help customers migrate to AIX version 7.2 with very little downtime associated with it. I'll make a couple of assumptions. First of all, I'm going to assume that you're already very familiar with NIM and, of course, AIX. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around what NIM is or any of the basic concepts such as what is a spot, what is an LPP source. So I'm going to assume you're already very familiar with the basics of NIM as it is. I'm also going to assume that you've got at least one NIM master in your environment today, potentially more. But if you're already familiar with AIX and NIM, then I assume you must have a NIM master somewhere in your environment that you use today to manage your AIX environment. I'm also going to assume that you're not familiar with the NIM-ADM tool. I'm assuming that you've come along today to hear me talk about NIM-ADM so you can learn how you can use it in your environment to help you migrate to the latest release of AIX. If you have used NIM-ADM in the past, there may not be too much in the way of new features that you're going to learn here. However, the second half of this presentation, which is more around best practices, tips and tricks, you may find something in there that you haven't come across before. And also, if you're really interested in learning more about NIM, perhaps you'd like to learn more of the basics or maybe learn some more advanced features, I would recommend that you download and read the NIM from A to Z in AIX5L Red Book. Now, that's a Red Book that I worked on over 10 years ago now, so it is a very old Red Book, but it still has lots of really good information in there. It will take you through some of the more basic features all the way through to some advanced features and also give you some other tips around problem determination and troubleshooting. All right, so before we talk about NIM and NIM-ADM specifically, let's first of all talk about migrating AIX using what I like to call conventional or traditional methods. So what did we do before we had NIM and NIM-ADM? How did we migrate AIX? And how does that compare to the methods I'm going to show you in this presentation? Well, over the years, having been an AIX administrator for a very long time, I've had to migrate to new releases of AIX on a fairly regular basis. And to do that, many years ago, I would have to use what I think are now old school methods. And those methods would typically consist of one of two things. The first being, you could migrate using AIX installation media. Now, in the 90s, when I was working with RS6000s and running AIX, that would typically mean that if I wanted to move to a newer version of AIX, I would need to grab a copy of an AIX CD, not a DVD, walk into a data center and actually insert that CD into my RS6000 machine, reboot the system off that installation media, and then initiate the migration using the installation media. On more modern systems, power systems that we have today, they also have the capability of migrating using physical media. If you have a DVD drive in your power system, you can actually insert the DVD into the drive, boot off that DVD and initiate the migration that way. However, that can become very impractical, especially in more large, virtualized, modern environments where you have hundreds of LPARs that you need to migrate. It's unlikely that you're going to go around sharing a DVD amongst a group of LPARs to perform the migration, particularly when you have very large environments. Also, in this day and age, data centers are often very remote, and it's sometimes impossible to actually insert a DVD into a drive because it's on the other side of the country or on the other side of the world. You can still do AIX migrations using AIX installation media using ISO images that you download from the IBM ESS website. And they can be uploaded to your VIOS virtual media library, and you can use those to initiate the reboot and the migration process. The other option that we could use before we had NIM-ADM was using a traditional NIM boot method. And by that, I mean you would actually reboot your system or your LPAR and network boot it over the network using your NIM master, and then initiate the migration over the network. That is different to what I'm going to be talking about today with NIM-ADM. But both of those methods, A and B that I have there on the screen, are still perfectly viable today. You can migrate using either of those today. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And I have links at the bottom of this presentation here that people can go to that will take you through each of those in more detail should you need to investigate that in the future. And as I said, you can still do migrations using AIX installation media. One of the most popular methods today to do that is to use the virtual media library on your VIOS. This is often called a poor man's NIM, in that if you don't have NIM in the environment or you have very limited NIM capabilities, you can actually use the virtual media library on your BIOS to initiate an AIX migration. And to do that, it's a fairly straightforward process. You would download the ISO images from the IBM entitled Software Support website, ESS. You would upload those images to your virtual media library that you can see here on the screen. Here I've got 2 DVDs that I've downloaded the ISO images and uploaded them into the virtual media library. And then I've simply loaded one of those ISO images into a virtual optical device and then mapped that to an LPAR. And I typically do this from the command line, but you can also do it from the HMC, where you go to Manage Virtual Storage, Virtual Optical Devices, you select the ISO image, you modify the partition assignment, and you assign it to a partition. And then from there, the LPAR will see a virtual CD device. And then you can simply boot your LPAR off that virtual CD device to initiate the migration. So as I said, this is a conventional migration method considered a poor man's NIM. So if you don't have NIM in the environment, this is a really good way of migrating to a newer release of AIX. And I've done this numerous times as well. Now, whether you use NIM or whether you use physical media or whether you use the virtual media library and a virtual CD to initiate the migration, as soon as you initiate that reboot of the installation media, the first screen you're going to see is this here, where it says "Welcome to AIX," and you'll see that AIX 7.2 has started to boot. And I can tell that I'm booting from virtual CD because it tells me I'm booting from the boot file.exe, which is coming straight off the installation media. So that's the first thing you're going to see. And then straight after that, you're taken into some BOSS installation menus, some base operating system installation menus. And here we can make a bunch of decisions on how we'd like to configure the system when we migrate. So we would always go into the second option here, which is change, show, install settings and install. And then because we're doing a migration, we would ensure that the third option here was selected, migration install. If you're migrating, you want to make sure this one is selected, the third option. If you have either of the other two selected, you may end up with a situation where your system has completely been overwritten, or you've got a partial install of AIX, which is certainly probably not what you were intending if you wanted to do a migration. That should already automatically be selected, just always a good idea to go in and check to make sure that's there. In the next screen, we'd make sure that we've got the right disk selected, the language settings are correct. We may want to change some of the security settings and select some additional software to install as part of the migration. Once we've been through those menus, we then type in 0 and hit enter, and then we sit back and wait for the migration to complete. And the wait time here could be rather lengthy. Now, whether you use NIM or whether you use installation media, a conventional AIX migration has one big problem, and that is downtime. As soon as you reboot your system using that installation media or booting off your NIM master, the applications that reside on those LPARs are now off the air. You've essentially impacted your business potentially, and you now have potentially users waiting for a system to come back online. And that downtime for an AIX migration can be as small as 30 to 45 minutes, or it could be an hour or more, depending on the system and how it's configured. And in environments where you have very tight outage windows and you have very small windows for periods of scheduled maintenance, this can be a real concern and a real problem. You may not have very long to get this migration done, and you will have a lot of pressure on you to get that completed. Also, you may be asked to do it after hours at very early periods of the morning, say 2 a.m., and this can be inconvenient for a lot of AIX administrators. And if you don't have your environment clustered for high availability, this can be a real problem. So I still deal with customers today that have very large LPARs running very critical workloads, and they don't have HA for those workloads. So if they want to take an LPAR off the air to migrate it to a new version of AIX, they will typically find that they will have a lot of pressure on them while that is occurring. So a lengthy outage for an AIX migration can be a problem for some customers that have these critical, mission-critical workloads running on large LPARs that aren't clustered or have no high availability where they can move the workload to another LPAR while they perform the migration. So this is where our friends, the NIM alternate disk migration tool, comes into play. It offers several advantages over a conventional migration. It uses a very straightforward and simple process of creating a copy of your existing root volume group on the NIM client to a spare disk. It uses alt disk copy to achieve that, and then it migrates that alternate disk to the newer version of AIX. And all of this can be done without any disruption to the LPAR and with no outage to your applications. All you need to do at a scheduled period of time is to reboot the system to bring it up into, in this case, AIX 7.2. Another advantage that I really like about this process is the fact all of the migration activity primarily occurs on the NIM master. So you're taking all the load off the LPAR, which reduces any processing overhead on the client LPAR and will help to minimize any performance impact on the running applications. Some other benefits, well, because this is NIM and we use it to administer large numbers of AIX systems, it's really good at doing more than one thing at a time. So you can use NIM ADM to migrate several clients at once. So that's a really nice feature of this tool. So if you can actually have several migrations occurring from a single NIM master at any point in time. So you're not limited to doing migrations in a sequential process. So the benefits that I've listed here are the 6 points that I've got down the bottom. So as I've already said, there's reduced downtime on the client. Your apps can stay up and running while the migration is occurring. The fourth point here is something that I found really good when I was working as AIX administrator for a large insurance company for many, many years. We were able to do migrations at a time that was convenient to us. So we could walk in on a Monday morning, kick off a NIM-ADM migration, and we wouldn't have to schedule an outage or a lengthy reboot or outage or migration at an early time in the morning, say 2 AM, like we had to many, many years ago. And the last point here also is the backout is very nice. So if there was some issue with the migration, we can easily fall back to the previous version of AIX. It doesn't require us to fall back to things like recovering from Maxis B, for example. So I'll take you through how that works and what that looks like. Some other reasons to use NIM-ADM, well, because this is NIM, it's a very flexible, customizable process. You can use standard things that we've seen with NIM for a very long time, such as image data files, BOSS instatators, pre and post migration scripts, exclude files, and so on. So if there's some resource that you typically like to use when you're performing a NIM operation, you can customize that as much as you like and assign those resources to the NIM-ADM operation as you need to. It also offers for quick recovery from migration failures. So by that, what I mean is, the way NIM-ADM works is it creates a complete copy of your existing root VG. So you can then go off and perform your migration activity. So if you have an issue with the migration or break the alternate root VG copy, you haven't broken the original system. The original root VG is still intact, your applications are still running, so you haven't actually incurred any serious problems as a result of that migration failure. And that gives you a good opportunity to rehearse this, go through the NIM-ADM operation several times before you're, until you're comfortable with it. Also, if you do encounters with NIM-ADM, you now have an opportunity to try and resolve it. And if that means you need to call IBM support and open a PMR, you've got that opportunity to do it, to work through it with our support guys, work out what the problem is. You can clean up the failed NIM-ADM migration and simply retry it. It's a really nice feature of this particular tool. And as I said, the backout, when you want to fall back to the previous level of AIX. So just say you've done the migration, you've rebooted into AIX 7.2, and you discover there's some problem after the reboot, and you need to fall back to the previous level. The backout is very simple. You simply reboot off the original root VG disk. That's really nice. Okay, so let's talk about preparing your NIM environment to support NIM-ADM. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that your NIM master is running AIX 7.2 with the latest technology level and service pack. So your NIM master should always be running the highest version of AIX that's available today. So if you want to migrate all of your systems to AIX 7.2, your NIM master must be running AIX 7.2. I still run across a couple of customers every now and then who try to migrate to a higher release of AIX without updating their NIM masters first, and they often run into trouble as a result. So your NIM master should be the first system in your environment to be upgraded to the newer release of AIX. So if you haven't already moved to AIX 7.2, please go and start looking at the NIM masters today and get them upgraded to AIX 7.2 as soon as you can. And I'll talk about how to upgrade the NIM masters in the coming slides as well. Once you've got your NIM master on the latest level, in this case AIX 7.2, you'll also need to create a new LPP source and spot to match the level that you want to migrate to. So if you want to migrate to AIX 7.2 or one of your NIM clients, you'll need to create a LPP source and a spot at AIX 7.2. So those resources will need to be configured once you've upgraded your NIM master. Also, the NIM master will need to have the boss.altdisk install RTE file set installed into its AIX 7.2 spot. So that spot that you created earlier for AIX 7.2, you'll need to go in and manually install that file set into the AIX 7.2 spot. And that is because the NIM master needs those commands available to it in order to create the alternate root VG and perform the migration. The last point on this slide is something that I don't often have to talk about, but I like to include it just to be clear, so people are very clear about what they need to do in certain scenarios. Just want to make it very clear that your applications and your application data should not reside in or run from root VG. So that means if you have DB2, Oracle, WebSphere, or any other applications running inside an AIX LPAR, the application's data and the applications themselves really shouldn't be living in root VG. They should be in separate volume groups. Most people understand that's best practice and are already doing it, although I do occasionally come across people that do have apps in root VG. Now, if you do have apps running live data outside of or inside of root VG, unfortunately, what you'll need to do if you want to use NIM-ADM to migrate is you'll need to stop the applications. The main reason for that is that because we create a clone of the existing root volume group, we essentially take a copy of the data at a point in time. And when you reboot off the alternate root VG into AIX7 one of two things will happen. Either your apps won't start because of some data inconsistency problem, or there will be data missing. And that is because we've created a clone of your root volume group. If you keep writing data to the original, we're not going to bring that data across later on. So if you do have apps that are running out of root VG, you're going to have to stop them before you run NIM-ADM, which really defeats the whole purpose of using NIM-ADM in the first place. So really, if you can, you should move your apps out of root VG if you have them. Fortunately, most people don't have that situation, but I felt the need to reiterate and make it very clear so people understand the consequences of putting apps into root VG. A couple of extra steps in terms of preparing the environment. The LPAR that you want to migrate must be registered as a standalone NIM client to the NIM master that will initiate the migration. So in the NIM database, you'll have to have a NIM client registered, and that NIM client will need to be able to talk to the NIM master. So the NIM master must be able to execute remote commands using NIMSH from the NIM master to the client. And you can see here that I've also said all RSH, and I've crossed that out. The reason I've done that is because RSH is a very insecure protocol and people really shouldn't be using RSH anymore. It is still a supported option, but most people should be using NIMSH today. If they aren't, they should be looking at NIMSH as soon as possible. But the point here is that NIM master must be able to execute remote commands on the NIM client using either NIMSH or RSH before you kick off the migration. The NIM client needs to have a spare disk allocated to it. And that disk should not be allocated to any volume group, and it needs to be large enough to contain a complete copy of the root volume group. So because we're creating a clone of your existing root VG, we need a disk that's large enough to create a complete copy of it. If you do have mirrored root VGs, what I have seen some people do is they'll break the mirror, take one of the disks out, and use that disk temporarily for the migration. I don't often see people with mirrored root VGs in AIX LPARs anymore, although there are still some out there. Most people these days will simply go to their storage team and ask for an additional SAN disk for the purposes of the migration. In the examples I'm showing you in this presentation, you're also going to need additional storage on the NIM master. You'll need enough free space on the NIM master, primarily in a separate volume group, to cater for a complete copy of the client's root volume group. Essentially, we copy data from the client down to the NIM master and then initiate the migration on the NIM master. So we need some temporary working space on the NIM master to initiate and perform that migration. Also, if you are performing more than one AIX migration at a time from multiple NIM clients, you need to make sure you have enough capacity to cater for all of the client's root volume groups that you're migrating. What I typically recommend to customers is to create a separate volume group for each NIM client that they're migrating and create those on the NIM master with their name, so it makes it very easily identifiable as to which volume group belongs to which NIM client. It also helps with I/O performance as well by separating those out onto their own separate disks. Now, by default, NIM-ADM will try and use NFS to perform the migration. And by that, I mean they will try and export the client file systems and then mount them on the NIM master and migrate them over the network. And what I typically tell people to do is to avoid using NFS. NFS writes can be very expensive over a network, and performance can be sometimes suboptimal. So it's often best to avoid NFS. So I recommend using local disk caching instead of using NFS with NIM-ADM. And local disk caching is a lot faster from my experience and offers several advantages really. It allows you to avoid using NFS. It also allows you to avoid having to export the client file systems as well in order to perform the migration. So if you use NFS, essentially we mount the file systems on the NIM master and do the migration over the network, which generates a whole lot of NFS traffic. And that can really be a problem, especially in networks that are already heavily congested with network traffic. With local disk caching, we create cache file systems on the NIM master itself. We copy all the data to those cache file systems using a streams protocol over NIMSH, and then we perform the migration on those cache file systems once the data has been copied. So I'll take you through an example of how that works coming up shortly. So as I said, avoid using NFS where possible and use local disk caching. You can avoid using NFS, which can be very slow at times. It also decreases the CPU usage on the client because we don't have that additional network overhead and processing of all the NFS traffic that will occur while the migration is taking place. Also, client file systems are not exported. So if you work in a security conscious environment, and most people do these days, exporting file systems with NFS is sometimes frowned upon and sometimes impossible in certain environments. So if you use local disk caching, there's no need to have NFS enabled for that. I've also got a note here about trusted computing base enabled systems, so TCB enabled systems. In the past, you couldn't migrate those with local disk caching and NIMADM. You couldn't migrate those with NFS and NIMADM, and you had to use local disk caching. That limitation has actually been removed now with AIX7 because TCB is not supported and it's essentially turned off when you migrate. But I leave it in here as a point of reference for people with migrating. And for best performance, I recommend that you have a separate bonding group that doesn't contain the resources being used for the migration. So wherever your LPP source and spot reside, don't use that bonding group for the cache file systems with NIMADM. Create a separate bonding group. It will help with performance. Some potential disadvantages, and I personally think these are minor disadvantages, but I want to make people aware of the impact it has when you select local disk caching compared to NFS. First of all, it will take up more space on the NIM master. So you're going to need space on the NIM master to perform the migration where it creates these cache file systems. So that requires disk space. I think that's a pretty minor requirement, a disadvantage, but it is something that you need to consider when you're doing your planning. There's also going to be increased CPU and disk I/O activity on the NIM master. Again, I think this is fairly minor. I like the fact that all of the activity is occurring on my NIM master rather than there being any overhead on the LPARs where my applications are running, where I really care about performance. We're going to require additional storage when you're migrating lots of NIM clients. So if you're doing a whole bunch, say 10 LPARs at once on a single NIM master, then you're going to need additional disk to support a copy of each of those clients' root bonding groups. So again, when you're doing your planning, you'll need to work out if you have enough storage to complete all those migrations at once. You need free storage that you can assign to the NIM master to do this and to the clients. So that's something else to consider. And also you may need more CPU and memory on the NIM master if you're performing lots of migrations as well. So if you're going to perform 10 or 20 migrations at once on a single NIM master, I can tell you right now, based on my experience, 4 GB of memory and 1 virtual processor is probably not going to be enough to get you over the line in a quick enough time for it to work well. You would need to probably bump up the CPU and memory on your NIM master when you're performing lots and lots of migrations at once. And people will often ask me, well, how much memory and CPU will I need? And there is no definitive answer. It really depends on how your systems are configured, what your network looks like, what your storage is configured, how your storage is configured. So it's something you'll need to test in your environment. It's one of those your mileage may vary kinds of situations here. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you're going to do lots and lots of migrations, you may need to revisit the CPU and memory that's allocated to your NIM masters. Okay, so NIMADM actually has 12 phases that it runs through, and I'm going to take you through all of those phases in a minute. But the first thing I wanted to do is just take you through what I think are the 4 most important steps when you're using NIMADM with disk caching. So at the end of this webinar, I'm hoping people will take this away as one of the takeaways, if you like, messages I'm trying to drive home here about how NIMADM with local disk caching actually works. And I think this sort of breaks it down into some fairly simple bite-sized pieces of information. So on the left-hand side here, I have a NIM master, and on the right-hand side, I have my NIM client. The NIM client, before I start the migration, has a single root VG on H60, and it's running AIX7. It also has a spare disk. At this point in time, this disk is empty and sitting there unassigned. On the NIM master, I also have a disk that has been assigned to a volume group called NIM-ADM VG. That's just the name I came up with. And that volume group is completely empty at this point in time. As soon as we initiate the migration, the first thing we do is we create a clone of your existing root volume group to the spare disk on the client. That just as an alt disk copy to HDisk1 in this example. And that is now a complete copy of HDisk0, and it's got a copy of AIX7 on here. Once that process is complete, we then copy all of that data over the network using NIMSH or RSH if you have that turned on, down to this cache volume group on the NIM master. So we're copying everything that's in this alternate root VG down here into these cache file systems. Once that copy is complete, we perform a migration. So we've got a copy of 5.3 here now, so we then migrate 5.3 to 7.2. So we're migrating that whole image to the latest release of AIX. And that is all occurring on the NIM master. There's no overhead on the client at this point, and our applications aren't impacted by any additional processing from network or disk I/O. Once that migration is completed on the NIM master, we then copy that migrated image that's now AIX7 again over the network using NIMSH to the alternate root VG. We then put that root VG to sleep and we change the boot list to point to HDisk1. The next time we reboot this LPAR, we're going to boot from HDisk1 and we're going to come up on AIX7 and the migration is done. So that's really what, when it comes down to it, that's what NIM-ADM is going to achieve for us. All right, so let's have a look at the 12 phases in a little more detail. So as I said, in the first phase, we create a copy of the client's root volume group. So we create this alt-inst root VG, and that creates a complete copy of the existing root volume group on the client. In the second phase, we create the cache file systems in the cache volume group on the NIM master. In my examples, I've called my volume group NIM-ADM VG. You can call it whatever you like, and you can call it anything up to 15 characters in length. As I said, if you're performing multiple NIM client migrations, you might create a volume group for each client and name it the client name VG, so you know which volume group, which cache volume group belongs to which client. And in phase 3, we then copy all the data from the NIM master, from the NIM client down to the NIM master's cache file systems. And this is all done via NIMSH. In phase 4, we can specify a pre-migration script. And that pre-migration script can be any script that you would like to run prior to the migration. And you can execute it in this phase. And that could be uninstalling or reconfiguring the system in some fashion before the migration. And one of the most popular uses I see of this pre-migration script is when people try to perform some sort of activity with third-party MPO device drivers that you may need to update or remove, and you typically can't do when you're SAM booting and the root volume group is active. And I've got a couple of slides on that later on in the presentation. So we can execute that in phase 4. You don't have to have a pre-migration script. If you don't have one, it will simply skip over. In phase 5, we save the configuration files, so things that are in etc, for example, like init.conf. We do some space calculations, make sure that file systems are the correct size for the migrated image. And then we lay down the new version of AIX, AIX7 over the top of that. And then we take the device database, so the ODM essentially, and merge that with your existing ODM with the new version of AIX. And that is no different to a conventional migration. That process is exactly the same. Phase 6 is where we migrate all the file sets to the newer version of AIX, and this is where most of the time is consumed. So this will take, at a minimum, half an hour to run through. It could take longer depending on how your system's configured, and it could be anywhere to an hour or more if you have lots and lots of file sets. Typically, at this point here, you're going to see a message saying that there's like 600 or 700 file sets that are being migrated. In phase 7, this is where you can specify a post-migration script. And again, this is where you can perform some customization to the image after the migration has occurred. And again, this could be installing or updating a piece of software. And it's simply a script that you can provide as part of the NIM resource when you perform the NIM ADM operation. In phase 8, this is where we create the new boss boot image for the client on Alt HD5. So we update that alternate boot logical volume that's in the cache file system for AIX7 too, so that we can boot from that. And keep in mind, this is all still happening on the NIM master. In phase 9, all the data has now been migrated, and we copy it from those local cache file systems back up to the NIM client into its alternate root VG. Again, this is all done over the NIMSH protocol. In phase 10, well, we've copied all the data from the cache file systems on the NIM master, so now we can unmount and remove those file systems. We don't need them on the NIM master anymore because we've copied the data back to the client. In phase 11, we put the alternate root VG to sleep on the client, and we set the boot list to point to that disk. So the next time we reboot the LPAR, we'll boot off the alternate root VG, and we'll come up on AIX7 too. And then in phase 12, we perform some cleanup to end the migration. And I do just want to point out that there is a way of running each of these phases individually. You can specify a capital P flag to the NIM ADM command, and you can run through these phases sequentially, one after the other. And this is really good if you're troubleshooting a problem with NIM ADM specifically. So I just wanted to point that out, that there is a flag here so you can run through phases 1 through 8, for example, fix a problem, and then run through the remainder if you need to. So 9 through 12, for example. That's a nice little tip. Right, in a couple of slides, we're going to go through an actual customer example that I worked through in recent times to help them migrate from 7.1 to 7.2. Before I get onto that, I just wanted to raise a few points for people to consider, specifically if you're thinking about using NIM ADM in your environment. And this is simply based off my experience as an IBM customer and also in recent times as an IBM consultant. So once you kick off this NIM ADM process, it's probably a good idea not to make any changes to the system once the migration is underway. And by that I mean, don't go adding local users, changing local passwords, adding or changing local print queues. If you're using LDAP for your user repository, then you're fine. But if you're changing things that change files locally in root VG and etc password or etc security password, you probably don't want to do that while the migration is running. And the reason for that is, again, we create a copy of your root running group. As soon as we create a copy of your root running group, if you make changes in the existing root VG, those changes won't be reflected in the alternate root VG. So when you reboot in AIX7.2, that new print queue that you added, for example, won't be available in that new AIX7.2 image. So what most people do in most production customer environments, they will raise change records, and they will have a change period where there is nothing allowed to change on the systems while the migration is occurring. Most people will do that. But if you're forced to make a change on a system that is currently migrating, you have an option here to either stop the migration and do it again later, or simply make note of the changes that you've made and reapply them after the system has been rebooted in AIX7.2. That's just something to be aware of. This is not a problem that's going to happen all the time, but you may come across it, and it's better to be aware of it ahead of time. Something else that I wanted to point out, again, this is as my time as an AIX admin working for an IBM customer for a long time. We actually use this to migrate hundreds of LPARs over a period of time. And what we did is we developed, tested, and verified our migration procedures many times before we actually got anywhere near our real production system. So we had crash and burn test environments where we could test the NIM ADM process and go through those procedures and scripts as much as we needed to. And we had other people on the team also run through those procedures and verify that they were rock solid before we even started on our non-prod systems. So what I recommend you do is you do the same. So you test this in your environment as thoroughly as you possibly can. If possible, you can do what we did on the odd occasion. We would actually clone some of our systems, real systems that had real workload, into our sandpit environment, run through the process to see if anything would shake out for us, any problems or issues that we may uncover. Like most Most environments, we did have a few problem child systems where we needed to do this and rehearse it a few times in order for us to shake out any bugs that we may have encountered. So the point being is, test it heavily in your environment. Your environment will be very different to environments that I've worked in, and you may find something that I haven't seen before. So it's always a good idea to test before you get anywhere near production. By the time you get to production, you should be 100% confident that your procedures will work without too many problems. Next point is around Multiboss. So if you have Multiboss in a root volume group today, you'll need to remove that Multiboss image before you can migrate with NIM-ADM. That limitation is actually being lifted with AIX7.2, but that will allow you to migrate from AIX7.2 to whatever the next generation of AIX is. They will actually allow you to have Multiboss enabled root volume groups. But today, if you have Multiboss in root VG and you want to migrate to AIX7.2, you'll need to remove that image before you can start. And you'll need to make sure that all of your logical volumes in the root volume group are named with their legacy names. So what does that mean? Well, you want your root VG legacy logical volumes to look like this. You want them to start with HD and nothing else. If you see boss_HD something, that is an indicator that Multiboss is enabled in that root volume group, and you'll need to remove it with Multiboss -R. If you're currently booted off these logical volumes, you may need to remove and then recreate the standby boss instance, and it'll go and recreate all the legacy names, and then you'll need to do a reboot. The important point here is to make sure you have these legacy names in root VG and you don't have any boss_ names. If you do, NIM-ADM will get all the way through to phase 11 and then fail and clean itself up, and you'll have to go and clean it all up and start again. So just something to be aware of. All right, so let's actually go through a migration example from a real customer, and I'll take you through screenshots of what it looks like and how we achieved an AIX7.2 migration with minimal downtime. Okay, so this customer was migrating from AIX7.1 to 7.2. Their NIM master was already running AIX7.2, and their client was running AIX7.1 TL3 SP3. And before we started, and I always do this with any customers that I'm working with, I made sure that we documented the system and took a make CSP. Now, everyone knows this, but I still have to say it just to make sure that people are clear that it's still a good practice. But before you perform any maintenance activity, make sure you document the system and take a make CSP. That way you've got a really good idea of how things were configured before you started, and you've got a way of getting out of whatever you've just done before you start doing any maintenance activity. Always read the AIX7.2 release notes. So we went through that with this customer. We reviewed the documents to make sure that simple things like how much free disk space do we need for the migration were catered for, and that we ticked everything off to make sure we were ready to initiate the migration. We also went through the HMC firmware BIOS code levels. We used the IBM FLIRT tool, fix level recommendation tool, to check the compatibility. So we punched in all of the current levels and the version of AIX that we were moving to, and we got a report back telling us that everything was green and we could go ahead with it. That's a great tool, the FLIRT tool. It'll come back and tell you if you have potential compatibility issues. It's always good practice to do that before you perform any kind of upgrade, migration, or maintenance activity. Another good practice is to grab this pre-migration script off the AIX installation media. Now this script will, which you can run on your LPAR before you migrate, will help you to catch any issues, such as you've got Multiboss turned on in root VG. And this will help you prevent any potential issues that might crop up either before or after the migration. So you can grab this script off the installation media for AIX7.2. You can see here I've given you an example of how to loop mount that media, and then I've gone hunting for the pre-migration script, and I found it in user LPP boss pre_migration. So then we copied that to this customer's LPAR, excuse me, and then ran the script. And it wrote some output to /home pre_migration.timestamp. It did a bunch of things, essentially checking the size of the boot logical volume and doing a whole lot of file set and LPP file set consistency checks to make sure that everything was okay before we started. And you'll end up with a bunch of text files in this directory here in /home pre-migration that you can go through and review before you kick off the migration. You'll also notice that it also recommends creating an AIX7 before you migrate. I also recommend committing any applied file sets before you migrate. 2 reasons for that. First of all, it saves space in the root volume group. And also, it helps you avoid some issues that I've had in the past where people have not done this and they've migrated, and afterwards they've had some old AIX file sets lying around from the previous version of AIX. And it was related to an issue with not committing before migrating. So always good practice to commit before you migrate. We checked the customer's NIM master. They had the Boss Alt Disk Install file set installed on the NIM master, but they also had it installed in their AIX7 spot. So we ran nim-o show res, the name of the spot, grabbed from boss.alt, and we can see that file set was installed. The customer didn't have a mirrored disk, but had they, we would have broken it and taken the disk out to do the migration. Essentially, all we did was ask the storage team to provide a new spare disk for the NIM client so that we could use that for the alternate root VG. We also then verified that we had good NIM/SH connectivity between the NIM master and the NIM client. And to do that, we used nim-o show log and the name of the client, NIM client. And that came back with good output. If that had come back with any error messages, that would indicate we have a NIM/SH communication problem, and we'd need to fix that before we could start the migration. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to migrate. And it was going to take roughly 30 to 45 minutes to migrate, all while their applications would remain running. And this was an LPAR running some WebSphere application servers, and everything was running out of a separate volume group, so that was all goodness. On the NIM master, we created a separate volume group for the cache file systems called NIM-ADM-VG on HDIS9. And one little tip that I wanted to throw out there that I got from Sean, our HA guy, he was saying that he actually renamed his NIM-ADM disk and called it something other than HDisk and a number. He called it something like Fred, and NIM-ADM failed. So don't go using rendev to rename disks to something that's not a HDisk. That will cause all sorts of problems. So once we created that volume group, we could see here that the volume group was completely empty. So doing an LSVG-L. And on the client, we had a spare disk. HDIS1 wasn't assigned to a volume group, and that would be our alternate root VG. And both of these disks on the NIM client and the NIM master were large enough to cater for a complete copy of the existing root volume group. All right, so I've done a lot of talking, but really what it comes down to is this command here. So you type in nim-ADM on the NIM master, you specify the -J flag for the cache volume group, which in my case was nim-ADM-VG, the name of the NIM client, the spot and the LPP source for AIX7, and the name of the spare disk on the client with the -D flag, and -Y. And that says to agree to license agreements during the migration. So all we have to do is hit enter on that, and we can sit back and watch the migration take place, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and don't worry if you miss any of the output on the screen while you're grabbing your cup of hot Earl Grey tea. Everything is written to a log file on the NIM master in var ADM ras alt_mig. And you'll find a log file in there with the name of your NIM client _alt_mig.log. And that'll have a complete copy of all the phases that were run. So if you miss anything, you can simply review that log file. It's also worth pointing out that if you run into problems with NIM-ADM, it's always a good idea to rerun that operation with the -D and V flags for debug and verbose. That will give you even more information that will help you diagnose why NIM-ADM is failing, for example. And if you're working with IBM support, they will often ask you to add those flags in order to diagnose a problem. So we hit enter, we see all this output. Let's have a look at each of the phases. This is what you'll typically see, and this is what we saw for this customer. Here we have phase one. So we're creating the alternate root VG using alt disk copy on HDisk1 to go off and create a clone of the client's existing root volume group. You can see all the logical volumes here and all the file systems that it's created in that root volume group. In phase two, on the NIM master, we go off and create all the cache file systems in MIM80 MVG. And you can see that each of the file systems are named with the name of the NIM client _alt, and then each of the file systems associated with what's in that alternate root VG. So if you're performing more than one migration at a time and using the same volume group for that migration, you'll see this is how it keeps all the file systems and names unique by putting the name of the NIM client at the very beginning of the mount point. So it creates all those cache file systems. That's where we're going to copy all the data once the migration takes place. So in phase three, we copy all of the data from the alternate root VG back into these cache file systems that we just created on the NIM master. In phase four, we didn't have any scripts running, but had we had one, a pre-migration script would have run at this point. And then we saw in phase five, conventional method again. This is simply saving the configuration files and merging the system configuration files, your ODM, with the newer version of AIX. In phase six, this is where we spend most of our time during the migration. You can see here it says installing and migrating software, and you can also see that it's telling me there's 681 file sets that it needs to migrate, hence why it takes most of the time. What you want to see at the very end of this is the result is success, and you want to see that the OS level returns is 7.2. So this is the piece that will take most of the time. There'll be screens and screens of output between this first file set and this final result at the end here. In phase seven, this is where we can run a post-migration script. In this customer's case, there was no post-customization script, so it simply skipped over that phase. Then we went off and created the new client boot image. And then in phase 9, we sync the data from those cache file systems back to the client. So we're copying all the data from the NIM master back up to the alternate root VG on the client, all that migrated data. In phase 10, we've copied all the data from the NIM master, so we don't need to keep it on the NIM master anymore. So we unmount and remove all those cache file systems off the NIM master. In phase 11, this is where we put the alternate root VG to sleep on the client, and then we change the boot list to point to that alternate root VG, which in this customer's case was HDisk1. So when we reboot this LPAR, it's going to boot off HDisk1. It's going to come up on AIX7 and then in phase 12, we simply run a cleanup operation to finish the migration. So once that's done, this is how our system looks. We have the original root volume group running AIX7 and the alternate root VG now running AIX7 The boot list has been automatically changed as part of the MIM80 process to point to HDisk1. So at an agreed time with the customer, which I think it was early evening around 7 p.m, we rebooted this LPAR. We ran an OS level beforehand and after to confirm that we've changed AIX levels. And you can see we did a shutdown -FR, and afterwards we were running AIX7 So that migration was essentially done at this point. We then went through and checked the state and the health of the system. So what does this mean? Well, the customer had some scripts that they ran before and after migrations, and they did this every time they performed maintenance activities. So they had a script that took a snapshot before and a snapshot after, and then gave you a comparison or a diff report, if you like, showing you this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like now, and they check the health of the system. And I've got a link here to a DeveloperWorks link that also has a system health checklist that you can use if you don't have one today. Most customers do have scripts they can run to check the health, but I've got here just a very short list in case you need to get started on one. But essentially, you're looking for all the critical components on the system are up and running as you would expect post-migration. So very basic things like have all my network interfaces come up, have all of my file systems, including my application file systems, mounted after the migration. So it's always a good idea and good practice to check that out. Also, at this point, we talked about whether they should upgrade things like OpenSSL, OpenSSH, LSOF, and other utilities they had on the system. Because they've moved to a new version of AIX, it's always a good idea to review other software you have installed and see if you need to update that to either support AIX or simply it's a good opportunity to upgrade it because you're taking some sort of activity to perform software maintenance at that time. So in this customer's case, we did update OpenSSL and OpenSSH and LSOF at that time. You can use post-migration scripts to automate this, which is something we did on subsequent migrations for this customer. And you can see here that I've got RSH. So if you had RSH turned on, you would disable it at this point. I'm not going to talk about RSH too much because it is an insecure protocol and hopefully people aren't using it. They should be using MSH these days. The next thing we did was ran another script that gets installed as part of the migration in user LPP boss called post_migration. We ran that script and it came back and performed a number of things for us. First of all, it did file set version consistency check and also made sure that the list of file sets that we had installed were compatible with the version of AIX that we just migrated to, and told us if there were any other actions we needed to take to make sure that software was compatible with the version we were running. And it also gave us a report of the configuration before and after the migration from a configuration file perspective. So things like changes to inod.conf. So when you run this script, it again writes things out to /home. This time it was in post_migration and a timestamp. And there's a bunch of text files there that you can go and review to make sure that the health of the system and the configuration of the system is looking good. So I recommend that you do that as well. So at this point, we handed over to their application teams, who then started up their WebSphere application servers, and they did some functional tests to make sure that their applications were working within normal parameters. So they would go through their standard scripts for checking that WebSphere and their apps were working well on AIX7 too. And at this point, I said it was a good idea to take another MakeSysB and document the system again at this point. So now we've got a MakeSysB before and after the migration, should we need it. Now, in this customer's case, they came back pretty quickly and said, yep, everything looks good. Migration's complete. Everyone can go home, which was fantastic. So we, again, discussed with the customer, at this point, you could theoretically remove the old root bonding group now, so the old AIX7 image. And to do that, you could use alt_rootvg_op-X and the name of the old root bonding group. And that will simply lose all memory of that and wipe that, and you can reuse that disk for something else. And if they'd had a mirrored root bonding group, then we would have returned that to a mirrored configuration at this point in time. Now, the period between migrating and removing the old root bonding group is really going to depend on how you do things in your environment. I know as a customer, in my environment for non-prod systems, we would leave that old root VG around for at least a week, just in case anyone from the application or dev teams came to us and said, actually, we think we do have a problem. Can we please fall back to the previous version of AIX? For our production systems, it was even worse. They would tell us to keep that old root VG around for sometimes a month or 3, or sometimes even tell us to hang on to it until the next month end or financial year came around. Now, keep in mind, the longer you keep those old root bonding groups around, the less appropriate they become. They're going to have old stale data on there, and I'm not sure how useful they'll actually be after 3 months have passed. But again, this is something you'll need to decide for your environment as to how long you keep that old root bonding group around. Now, in this customer's case, everything was great, but what if there'd been a problem? So if the application teams had come back and said, you know what, we've got a problem with our app and we're not sure if it's the app or whether it's AIX7 too, how would we have returned the system to the previous level of AIX? Well, that would have been a fairly straightforward process. We would have looked for the old root VG, changed the boot list to point to the old root VG and rebooted the system. And then we would have simply come up on AIX7.1 and they could have handed back control of the app to them and they could have tested it to see if the issue was with their app or whether it was an AIX problem. And the good thing is here that if you need to flick between the two, you can simply boot off either disk whenever you need to. The point being that the backout is very simple. There's no need to restore a MakeSysB, which you may have done in the past with conventional migrations. So there you have it. That's essentially what NimADM does. It's really good for helping you to avoid lengthy after-hours upgrades. I'm hoping that you've learned something in this session about how you can migrate to AIX7.2, reduce the downtime, give you a convenient way to back out. And when the time comes, you might come back and refer to this presentation to give you some more tips on how you can migrate to AIX7.2 and reduce the downtime associated with it. Now, I have a link to an article I wrote some time ago now on NIM-ADM, which takes you through even more detail than what I provide here, in case you need it. Now, the remainder of this presentation is other tips, tricks, best practices for AIX migration and NIM. So we're still going to talk about NIM and NIM-ADM, but there are some other tips in here that I wanted to share as well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was an alternative migration technique with NIM-ADM. This is something I did many years ago now for a customer that was wanting to migrate from old hardware on Power 5 to Power 7, but at the same time, they also wanted to migrate to AIX7.1, and they were running 6.1 on the Power 5 hardware. So to do this, as part of the migration, we were actually taking MakeSysBs of the systems and installing them on their new hardware. So NIM-ADM actually was a godsend here, because we were able to take those MakeSysB images, and instead of simply just installing them straight onto the Power 7 box, we could migrate those 6.1 images to 7.1 first and then install them onto the Power 7 box. Essentially achieving two things at once for the customer, and they were very happy with this. So essentially what you can do is take a MakeSysB of the old version of AIX and then use NIM-ADM to migrate it to the newer version of AIX, and then you can use that to do a standard NIM install of a new LPAR. In the example I have here on the screen here is the customer was running AIX6.1. We took a MakeSysB of that LPAR to their NIM master, and I called that MakeSysB resource CG AIX6.1. My NIM master was already configured with an LPP source and spot for AIX7.1, so that was already ready to go. And then I ran this command here, NIM-ADM -T, and the capital T specifies the AIX6.1 MakeSysB resource that I want to migrate. And then the -O flag says this is where I want you to write out the new AIX7.1 MakeSysB image. It's going to write out a brand new AIX MakeSysB image for me. And it used this spot and this LPP source for AIX7.1 to do the migration. It uses the cache volume group just like we did in the previous example. So it actually extracts the MakeSysB, performs the migration, and then packages it all up again and splits it out into this export MakeSysB directory. And we said, yes, we want to accept license agreements, and please create me a new MakeSysB resource called CG AIX7.1. So this is essentially just a couple of screenshots of some of the data that I saw. The first thing that it did is it extracted the image.data file from the MakeSysB to work out what cache file systems to create. So it went off and created those, then extracted the MakeSysB image into those files, file systems, and then did the migration. And at the very end, it created a brand new MakeSysB resource called CG AIX7.1. You can see here at export MakeSysB, there's this new file. And then from there, I could use that MakeSysB image to do a brand new NIM install of a new LPAR on the Power 7 system. And when I ran OS level, lo and behold, it said it's running AIX7.1. And I have an entry on my AIX blog that goes into even more detail about what I did and how this helped the customer, if you need to refer to it. Anyway, I think it's a fairly cool use of the NIM-ADM tool. Another consideration for migrating, and also with NIM-ADM, is around JFS and JFS2 file systems. Now, some people still have JFS in root VG, and where possible, they should be thinking about moving away from JFS as much as they can. It's certainly a legacy file system today. Unfortunately, though, if you're using NIM-ADM to migrate to a newer version of AIX, it doesn't convert those file systems from JFS to JFS2. I've actually opened an RFE to request this feature, so please vote for it. But in the meantime, we do have a couple of options up our sleeve to move away from JFS file systems. And that is by using Alt+Copy with the -T flag. So starting with AIX6.1CL4, you can run this, and it will create you a brand new alternate root VG and convert all the file systems from JFS to JFS2, and that works really well. And then you can migrate to the newer version of AIX. Unfortunately, if you're running older unsupported versions of AIX, like 5.3 or lower, there is no -T flag with Alt+Copy. So your only option here is to run NIM-ADM to migrate to a new version of AIX, still on JFS, and then run Alt+Copy afterwards to migrate from JFS to JFS2. If you need to do this or you're interested in learning more about it, please look at the blog link I have here where I take you through an example of how I did that for a customer. I've talked about pre and post migration scripts a little bit today. They are available with NIM-ADM, so you can either minus A or Z flag to specify pre or post migration scripts. One of the most popular usages of these scripts is with updating third-party MPO device driver file sets. Or if you're updating other open source software, you can run scripts to update them post the migration. Particularly MPIO device driver file sets can be a popular usage because it's often difficult to update them, especially if you're using non-IBM storage and you're sand booting off disk and your root VGs are active and you try and update the software and it may tell you that it can't because the device is currently in use, and they will tell you to perform some painstaking cumbersome process to do the update. So, and also when you migrate to AIX7 too, it's sometimes required that you move to the newer version of file set for the level of AIX that you're moving to. You need to upgrade those as part of the migration. So NIM-ADM comes to the rescue here. You can specify a -Z flag and specify your own script to perform that update. And I have an example on my blog on how to do that in detail. And that's really only if you're using non-IBM storage. If you're using something like STD PCM, please wait for the next couple of slides where I talk about how to migrate with NIM-ADM and if you're using STD PCM storage. But if you need an example on how to use pre and post scripts with NIM-ADM, please check out that link at the bottom. Something else to consider, if you have a 7.2 NIM master and you want to migrate to a lower level of AIX, you'll need to perform one specific step for the spot that you're using. So, for example, just say you've got a 7.2 NIM master and you want to migrate a client from 5.3 to 7.1 or 5.3 to 6.1 or 6.1 to 7.1, but you're not going to 7.2. Once you kick off that NIM-ADM process, as you can see I'm doing in the example here, I'm migrating this 5.3 L part to 6.1 and I'm using a 6.1 spot and a 6.1 LPP source. You'll be presented with this lovely error message here saying that the BOSS Alt Disk Install RTE file set is not at the level that matches the NIM master. So it's looking for a 7.2 file set in a 6.1 spot. It's a little confusing, a little counterintuitive, but what you need to do is install the BOSS Alt Disk Install RTE file set, the AIX7 version, into that spot. So if you're going to 7.1 or 6.1, you need to install that file set into the spot before you can migrate. And this is essentially how you do it. Go into SMIT NIM ResOp, select the 6.1 spot, select the AIX7 LPP source, and install the BOSS Alt Disk Install RTE file set into that spot image. And that will solve that problem. Just a very quick tip on Multiboss and NIM-ADM. This is something I came across many years ago now, but I still include it in case someone else trips over this. I don't think it's a problem anymore, but I'm including it just in case. So if you're migrating to a new version of AIX and you have Multiboss enabled, you know that's not supported. And one of my customers knew this and they ran Multiboss -R and then ran NIM-ADM, and it was still complaining that Multiboss was enabled, and it would get to phase 11 and fail and clean up and they have to start all over again. And I came along and said, oh, you just run Multiboss -R and it'll clean everything up. And of course, we ran NIM-ADM and it failed again. And it turned out that Multiboss -R wasn't cleaning everything up properly for whatever reason, and we had to manually remove the /boss_inst directory from the root file system, and then NIM-ADM was happy and it ran. So you may not come across this, but if you do, at least now you're aware of this. I have people ask me this all the time. Can I migrate from a really old version of AIX to AIX version 7 using NIM-ADM? Well, yes, you can. And in fact, I had a customer of mine do this last year where they actually wanted to run an old, very old app, unsupported app on AIX 4.3.3. It's a very unusual problem, but they wanted to do this. And then they wanted to migrate that all the way through from AIX 4.3 to 5.3 to 7.1 to make sure the app would actually work. And then they were going to do some other weird and wonderful things with it. I said, well, yes, you can, but that's great. But you'll need to find some hardware where you can run AIX 4.3.3. And they said, well, actually, under my desk, I've got a couple of F50s. So these are all Power PC 604E RS6000 systems. And he said, but I don't have any AIX433 media. Well, of course, in my stash, I did have a full set of AIX433 media. So I went out on site, we installed 433 onto this old F50 that had old SCSI disks in it. We put it on the network, they got their app up and running, and then we used NIMADM to migrate it from 433 to 5.3, and that all worked fine. There was one little bump that I'll talk about in a minute, but it worked. We then took that 5.3 MakeSB image, we installed it into onto an LPAR on a Power 7 box on a 795, that big fridge in the bottom right-hand corner, and then we migrated that to AIX7, and their app happily worked, and they were very happy to achieve what they needed to achieve. As I said, we had one little hiccup that stopped us for about an hour where we were doing the 433 to 5.3 migration using NIMADM, and it bombed out in phase 8 saying that it couldn't write out the client boot image. And it dawned on me sometime later after I started reading some release notes again for AIX version 5.3 that potentially our boot logical volume wasn't large enough. So these F50s had old SCSI disks, and the boot logical volume was 1 pp in size, and that was 8 megabytes. And the release notes clearly state for AIX 5.3 that the boot logical volume needs to be 12 meg in size. So 8 meg wasn't going to be large enough to hold the new boot image for AIX 5.3. So we simply extended the boot logical volume, which you can see down at the bottom here, ran a boss boot, and then reran NIMADM, and that allowed this operation to complete. So it went from 8 meg to 16 meg, a whopping 16 megabytes in size. So yes, you can migrate from very old versions of AIX to AIX version 7 using NIMADM. It is certainly possible. Please read documentation. So a couple of links here on the screen, but I just want to reiterate. I've talked a lot about how to migrate using NIMADM. What I haven't really talked about is how to prepare to migrate. And our support guys have got a great document that will take you through how to prepare, so what things to think about, such as are your apps supported on AIX? How much file system space do I need? This link here, this tech note is fantastic. Please read that. You only need to read it once. You'll absorb everything you need to know, and then you'll be able to move ahead. Also, read the AIX7 installation tips. That has information that you won't find anywhere else. In fact, I learned that if you're migrating from AIX7.1 to 7.2 and you've been doing some tuning with IO, J2, inode, cache, and metadata tunables, you may need to make some changes afterwards. Had I not read that tech note, I would not have known about it. So please read all this material that's available to you. It's certainly worth the hour or so of your time. If you're using IBM storage and STD PCM, I'll say this up front. Please open a PMR with our support guys if you want to migrate to a newer version of AIX. Why is that? Well, if you've been using STD PCM for a while, you'll already know this, but I'll just go over it briefly in case people don't know this. If you're on AIX7.1 today, you will have, and you're using IBM storage such as SVC disk and STD PCM, you will have this file set installed, devices.std PCM 7.1 RTE. If you migrate to AIX 7.2 as is, at the end of the migration, you'll still have this file set, devices.std PCM 7.1, and you'll be running AIX 7.2. As soon as you do that, you now have an unsupported configuration. When you move to a newer version of AIX, you must uninstall this old file set and install the newer file set to the level of AIX that you're running, which in this case is devices.std PCM 7.2. You just can't uninstall that file set, however. So this is why you need to open a PMR with our support guys and request some scripts to help you achieve that outcome. They have scripts that you can use with NIMADM as a pre and post migration script, which is fantastic, which will allow you to migrate from AIX, whatever version of AIX you're on, to 7.2, and also update that file set at the same time. If you migrate and you don't update that file set, you're going to have to go through and take another outage to migrate to that newer level of STD PCM file set. So better to do it up front. Also, if you're not using NIMADM and you're just using a conventional migration, they also have scripts for that as well. So please open a PMR and ask for the appropriate scripts. They don't allow you to download those yourself. They want you to log a PMR and talk to our support guys so they can give you the appropriate scripts for your environment. Again, I've talked a lot about how to migrate NIM clients. I haven't talked about how to upgrade your NIM master to AIX 7.2. I wrote an article last year for IBM Systems magazine that talks about how to migrate your NIM master to AIX7 using the BIOS Virtual Media Library. And that'll take you through how to do a conventional migration using ISO images from the IBM ESS website to get your new master up to the newer version of AIX. And it will also take you through the basic steps of how to create a new occupancy source and spot using those ISO images as well. A couple of slides on tunables. So if you're migrating to a newer version of AIX, you should review your tunables after the migration. I use a command called tune check after I've migrated a system to make sure that my tunables are appropriate. I also check the AIX error report to make sure that there's no restricted tunable messages after the migration. And in this example here, it's telling me that I have some VMO tunables that have been modified that probably shouldn't have been modified post-migration. So this is an indicator that perhaps my tunables need to be reviewed. If you're migrating from a very old version of AIX, such as version 5.3, version 5.2, 5.1, and you're going to 7.2 or 7.1 or 6.1, it's likely that the tuning you had on those older versions is not appropriate for AIX7.2 or 7.1. You can quickly determine if that might be the case by running tune check against the Nextboot tunables file, and it'll come back and tell you if there are any restricted tunables not at their defaults. And you can see in this example here, it's also telling me there's an unknown parameter for one of those tunables. And that's a dead giveaway that there's perhaps something in here that I need to review on this system, particularly in the Nextboot file that is hard-coded. So unless you've got a really valid reason for keeping some of that old tuning around, and when I say valid reason, I mean you've talked to IBM support and they've told you to use that value on the new version of AIX, you should be setting all those values back to their defaults. So you should be using, in this case, there was an example here of maxperm wasn't set to its default. You can use VMO -P and the -D flag to set it back to its default. If you want to be heavy-handed, you can use the -D flag. Just be aware that will require a boss boot and a reboot to take effect, but that will reset all of the tunables for VMO to their defaults. And you can do the same for IO, Shadow, and the network tunables as well with NO. If you've hard-coded tuning in the Nextboot file, when you do the migration, that hard-coded tuning will be left as is. The migration will assume that you know what you're doing and will leave that tuning in place. If you don't have anything in the Nextboot file, the migration will go through and change things based on the level of AIX that you're moving to. So for example, if you're going from AIX 5.3 to 7.2, and you haven't hard-coded things like maxperm and minperm, it will change them from 80 to 90 and 20 to 3. So it'll go ahead and put things to the values that it thinks it should be at. That's only if you haven't hard-coded things in the Nextboot file. And starting with AIX7.1, this LRU file repage tunable, which was an unknown parameter on the previous slides, is now gone. It's a hard-coded tunable. It's no longer available as a hand tunable. And this is just another example of why you should review your tuning whenever a new release of AIX comes out. Go back and review your tuning. A couple of quick tips if you need to look at your old disks post-migration. Say you've logged into an LPAR and you don't know what is on that old root VG. How do you find out what level of AIX is on it? You can see here we're running AIX7.2, but the old root VG is running something else. What is it? Well, you wake it up using alt root VG ops with a -W, and then you can use chroot to get a shell inside that environment and then do an OS level. And it comes back and tells me, oh, this is actually 7.1 TL4 SP3. And then once I'm done, I can put the root VG to sleep. And now at least I know what's on that disk. You can also use the BLV set command with the -G flag, -G level, and that will tell you what is the AIX level in the boot logical volume in its pad string. And it'll come back and tell you what version of AIX it thinks is on that disk. If it's incorrect, you can actually use the -P level flag to input the correct level. So you press enter, you type in 7.2 if that's the level you think it is, and you can correct the pad string. Why would you need to do that? Well, you probably won't need to do it these days. It's more of a, if you want to check the version of AIX, you can use this command. I came across this years ago when I was doing conventional migrations and the boss menus were not giving me that migration option. And that was because there was an issue with the pad string on the disks and I had to run the BLV set P level command to fix that problem. So at the bottom here, I've got an example of what that output would look like. I've talked about MSH quite a bit and RSH. Just want to point out that up until a few years ago, we didn't have an option to use RSH with NIM-ADM for migration. So it wasn't until AIX6 TL8, 7 TL2 that we brought in support for NIM-SH with NIM-ADM, and you could essentially turn off RSH and you would not need it anymore for NIM-ADM. So yes, RSH is still supported, but eventually it's likely that support for that will disappear over time. So it's better to start moving to NIM-SH as soon as you can if you haven't already. The only thing I have noticed is that NIM-SH with NIM-ADM, the migration process will take a little bit longer, roughly 20 minutes based on my testing. But given that everything's still up and running while you're performing the migration, I think that's not really a concern. A quick tip on NIM-SH, SSL, LPM, and MakesSBs. So I've had some customers cut me in the last couple of years saying that they've used LPM to move an NIM client to another frame, so they've moved an LPAR somewhere else. And after a period of time, the MakesSB stopped working, so the NIM master can't take a backup of that LPAR anymore. The main reason for that is that NIM-SH without SSL uses the CPU ID to authenticate to the NIM master. And when you LPM an LPAR from one frame to another, nothing's restarted. So NIM-SH still has cached in memory the old CPU ID from the old frame where it was running. Now, over a period of time, people might restart that LPAR on the new frame or restart the NIM-SH subsystem. When they do that, it restarts and uses its new CPU ID on the new frame where it's currently running. So the NIM master says, I want to perform a MakesSB, and tries to talk to the NIM client, and it returns a CPU ID that doesn't match what's in the NIM database and rejects the connection. And that's why their MakesSB stopped working. So to avoid that, you can use SSL with NIM-SH instead. With SSL configured, we use SSL certs on the NIM master and the client, and we use that to do the authentication and verification to prove who the NIM client is when the NIM master talks to it. It's a pretty straightforward process, and I've got a couple of links here to my blog of how to configure that. Essentially, you run nimconfig -c on the NIM master, and then nim client -c on the NIM client to set up SSL. And when you do an ls-nim against the NIM client, it should say connect type is NIM-SH, and you should have secure in brackets. If you are thinking about doing this in your environment, please review this APAR at the bottom here that talks about a potential issue with NIM-SH and SSL. You may need to grab that iFix. If you're using NIM to install BIOS, so you have BIOS that are actually NIM clients, you should review this table often, particularly if you're moving to a newer version of BIOS code. So for example, if you're going to move to BIOS 226.10, for example, you'll need to make sure that your NIM master is at these minimum levels here. So if you're running AIX7.2, it has to be a TL2 SP1. So review this table often. It'll tell you that what your AIX level should be on your NIM masters in order to install, backup, restore, etc. your BIOS systems. Some known issues with NIM-ADM and AIX migration that I've come across in recent times. If you're planning to migrate from AIX7.1 TL5 to 7.2 using NIM-ADM, and that's that specific level from AIX7.1 TL5, using NIM-SH, you will need to install these iFixes. Go and open a call with our support guys and ask for the iFixes for $1,500 and $1,499, these APARs. And that will get you around a problem that currently exists with that specific level when you're migrating to AIX7.2. If you don't have the iFix or you can't get it, you can use RSH instead of NIM-SH. Another problem I've come across very recently is sometimes NIM-ADM with CacheVG will fail when you're updating a bunch of RPMs that are in the LPP source. This is a bug, and there is an iFix for that as well, which you can grab from our support team. You'll see this error message, change FS, saying there was something not found in ETC file systems. You can work around this by using NIM-ADM without CacheVG, so that will fall back to using NFS. But I would recommend getting the iFix and installing that on your NIM master as soon as you can. Also, if you're using using the CIFS file set on your AIX7.1 LPAS today and you migrate to AIX7.2, you will find that that file set will still be down level when you migrate, and it will produce an LPP check error. You will need to go and download the AIX7.2 expansion pack. This file set is no longer shipped with the AIX installation media. So you'll need to download the expansion pack from the IBM ESS website, mount that ISO image and grab that file set and install it as I've shown on the screen here, and then do an update all at the end to bring it up to the appropriate level. So they're the main ones that I've encountered in the last few months. Some online resources. We have a good tech note from our support guys on how to use NIM-ADM. Please review that. There's my blog, Rob McNally's blog. We both have good tips on AIX and NIM all the time. And then, of course, my articles on Developer Works and IBM Systems magazine. There's some good people to follow on Twitter. Apart from me, there's also Christian Milos, who's an IBM Systems champion, Rob McNally, also a champion, Chet Mehta from our Power Systems development team. Our AIX documentation folk have some good information as well. And of course, Gareth and Nigel, both Power Systems experts. You should be following them if you're not already on Twitter. And my final slide. So because I work in IBM Systems Lab Services, I like to help customers adopt new technology. So if you think you need some help adopting NIM-ADM, we do have an engagement that you can take advantage of, where we can come on site, spend a couple of days with you, do a proof of concept, get your NIM environment up and running so you can use NIM-ADM, and we can help you work through that process. So if that's something you're interested in, reach out to me, let me know. And with that, that brings me to the end of my presentation. And I guess if we have time, I think I've run over, but if we have the opportunity, we could go to questions now, I think, Joe.
Okay, so yeah, we did run over a bit here, Chris, just a minute. But there are a bunch of questions that unfortunately I just didn't feel confident enough to put a definitive answer on. Sorry about that. So if you want to take some time, Chris, we'll take a couple minutes. It might be best for you to pop open the window and take a look.
Yeah.
At them. I'll let you just get started with that anyway, and you can maybe scan through them. I think what I'll do also is I'll save the questions log. I can send it to you. You know, maybe we can get some answers, and then I can post it on the wiki as well. So while you're looking up that, I'll just a couple of things here to give you some time, Chris. Is of course, you know, the presentation's out on the wiki. Everyone, I said that at the beginning, but a lot of people weren't here then. So presentation's out on the wiki. You can download the presentation. All those links that were in the back of Chris's presentation here that he showed just recently are all in that. So you can use those links, and you have contact info in there as well. So feel free to download that. I will be putting the replay up on the wiki sometime, hopefully today or tomorrow, up on the YouTube, and put a link on the wiki today or tomorrow, so that'll be there as well. So with that, Chris, you see anything that maybe is applicable that would be good to talk about here in the questions?
I see that you answered someone's question about Power 9 systems. That's a valid point. They don't ship with DVD drives, so that's fine. Someone's asking, how do you get older ISO images? Well, as a customer, you should be able to get some ISO images from the IBM ESS website. And yes, this process that I've just talked about is migrating from AIX7 to 7.2. You can also use the same process to migrate from older versions of AIX, as I described in the presentation.
I thought a good question was about if there were iFixes, and also just going, I mean, you know, not 7.1 to 7.2, but different TLs and stuff. And, you know, normally a TL isn't a downtime anyway, but you could still use the sort of the same procedure,
so,
right?
This process is only for migrating to a newer release of AIX. So if you're looking for a tool to move you to a newer TL or SP, this tool doesn't currently do that. This is only migrating to a newer version of AIX. I do know that someone has actually requested that feature with this tool, but it doesn't currently provide that at the moment. So there are other tools that you can use, such as Multiboss, and NIM does have the capability of allowing you to move to a new TL and SP using an alternate disk, but it's not this same tool here. This is for moving to a newer version of AIX.
Okay.
If you have iFixes installed, no, there's no issues. It'll essentially remove those as it needs to as part of the migration. iFixes are an interesting one because as soon as you've moved to a new version of AIX, you typically need to go to the Flirt tool and have a look and see if there are any iFixes that you need to install. You can actually take care of that during the migration using a post migration script and have those iFixes installed and handled as part of that migration piece. Someone says, how many NIM clients do we migrate at a time? Well, that will depend on your environment. It will depend on your network, how your systems are configured with CPU and memory. and also on your storage devices. My experience is I've seen customers do as little as 5 at a time on a single NIM master, and as many as 20 at a time on a single NIM master. I've also seen in most large environments, they'll have more than one NIM master, so you can do migrations across multiple NIM masters at once if you need to spread out those activities across multiple NIM masters. So yeah, there's a few questions about number of clients. And I think I answered that question about changes to the root VG file system. Yes, once we create the alternate root VG, any changes you make to the original would be lost. So do an under change control. Go making changes once the migration has been kicked off. Can you use NIM if you have a mirrored root VG? Yes, you can. There's no limitation there. As I said, there's no update all option here. This is simply a migration option. Can you use NIM to upgrade the NIM master? Officially, no. If that's something you would like to know more about, then send me an email. Most people will use a conventional migration method to migrate their NIM masters. If you have a bunch of NIM masters, it is possible to use NIM to migrate a NIM master, but there are some additional steps that I haven't covered in here that I'd be happy to share with people if that's what they'd like. But traditionally, no, you would use a conventional migration. I think I answered that. Can I use a NIM master running 7.2 to upgrade a NIM client to 7.1? Yes, you can. You'll just need to make sure that the 7.1 spot that you're migrating to has the Boss Alt Disk RTE installed file set from the 7.2 LPP source in that spot. Must the spare disk be a H disk? Yes, as far as I know, that's the only option. Someone's asked me about firewall protocols and ports. Yeah, it might be worth actually, Joe, if I take a couple of days and I can answer some of these questions and send them back to you in a document that we can upload to the wiki, perhaps.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
I don't want to run too far over here, so let's go ahead and do that. Yeah. I'll capture all these in a document, Chris. I'll send it to you, and then when we get some answers on them, we'll go ahead and I'll put them up on the wiki, and so everybody will have to give us a little bit of time for doing that. All right.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and do that. And second here, just wanna, there. Okay, so with that, I want to say thank you, Chris. I know you're going to have a long, tired day now that we got you up in the wee hours of the night, but I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of great information that you shared with us today.
Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me talk about this for the last hour and a half. And if people have any questions they think of after the session, please feel free to send me an email. I'd be more than happy to answer any emails that come through.
Perfect. And I'll be getting out the next webinars shortly. We've got a busy next couple of months with all these things going on, but I think in April we'll do another one. I'm looking at maybe doing a NVMe. A lot of questions on NVMe with Power 9, so I'm looking at some of that for our next webinar. So hopefully we'll get there. But thank you, everybody. Have a great day and a great weekend, and thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Joe.
Goodbye.